Hi everyone, it's Jeff Saks from Matzid and WebYeshiva with another episode of the History of Halacha in 100 Objects. And as you can see, tonight we are talking about the MEZUZAH. Just to clarify something that we're trying to do here in this series, obviously each class in this course is covering one particular piece of material mitzvah object. We can't obviously cover the entirety of all of the relevant halachot to MEZUZAH or Kiddush cup or Chelet or any other thing that we're going to be looking at. I'm trying to take one particular aspect of each of these everyday items. The MEZUZAH specifically is something that we encounter sometimes quite literally every time we walk in and out of a room. Those of us that live here in Eretz Yisrael, that's particularly so. Trying to think of the last time I entered or exited a room, besides a room that does not require a MEZUZAH, like the bathroom, that I didn't pass a MEZUZAH on the doorpost, in my home, in my synagogue, in my workplace, in the stores and shops that I frequent. Every doorpost has a MEZUZAH. The Rambam says that in the organization of his Mishnah Torah, he groups together a category of mitzvot under the title of Ahava, love, Sefer Ahava. One of the 14 books, the second of the 14 books of the Mishnah Torah, is called Sefer Ahava. So, in answer to the musical question, who wrote the book of love? The answer is the Rambam. Sefer Ahava deals with the whole variety of everyday mitzvot, prayer and blessings and tzitzit and tefillin and MEZUZAH and the like. And he says that these are all the types of day in, day out rituals that are meant to draw us into constant mindfulness of God and, if properly executed, draw us towards the love of God. They're, of course, the big mitzvot, the things that we encounter only once a year, or even less rarely than that. Who's not excited to eat matzah on Seder night, or sit in the sukkah on Sukkot night, or hear the shofar on Rosh Hashanah morning? These are the uncommon mitzvot. But the day in and day out, every time you take a sip of coffee, you stop and pause and say a blessing. Every time you pray in the morning, during the weekdays, you wrap tefillin. Every time you walk in and out of a door, you encounter the Shema Yisrael encased in the MEZUZAH. As the Rambam himself was very careful to point out, the MEZUZAH is no mere amulet. It's not some kind of, as some foolish people mistakenly thought, that it's some kind of magic charm to ward evil spirits away from your door. Not at all. It is meant to cause your passages through life and through space and through time and through the world in which you occupy, your home, your goings out and your comings in the words of the Pasuk, to cause momentary pause, perhaps subliminal, perhaps quite deliberate, that God is one, that we love Him, that He commands us. That is, of course, the text of the MEZUZAH. This is what the MEZUZAH cloth looks like, containing the first two paragraphs of what we recite every day as Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, and the paragraph of V'haya im Shmo Tishmu el Mitzvotai, of reward and punishment, the yoke of mitzvot, in which we actually say uchtavtam al mezuzot beitecha uvisharecha, that we should write these words, the antecedent of the words being this paragraph itself as well as the Shema. We should write these words on our doorposts of our homes and on the gates. Laman yirbu yemechem v'yimei b'nechem al ha'adama shenishba Hashem lavotechem latet lahem kimei hashamayim al haaretz, so that He may lengthen our days and those of our children upon the earth that He has promised us, presumably Eretz Yisrael. Not by some kind of magic charm. If you put a mezuzah on your door, you'll live a long life. But if you put a mezuzah on your door and internalize its message of mindfulness of God, of the mitzvot, of leading a committed life, the way that lahavdil, the people used to tie a little string around their finger to remind them of something. That might be a better metaphor for tzitzit, of course, and their strings. But the same thing, that if you infuse your day with these teeny little reminders, that as you walk out of your home, on your way to work, you walk into your office, you walk out of your office, back into your home, whether you literally kiss the mezuzah, as some people have a custom, or you just bear these messages in mind, these teeny tiny little reminders throughout your day, that will cause you to live a godly life, and that in that merit will you have length and prosperity. The question I'd like to talk about today is not so much the mezuzah itself. This is the mezuzah, written by a scribe on a piece of parchment, rolled up. The practice is to roll it starting from this end, so that the outer end is here with the Shema, so that if you were to unroll it, you would be able to read it from right to left, and to place it into the mezuzah case. Now, it's a mistake when we refer to this object or any number of other similar items that look identical to it, this object as the mezuzah. This is in fact not the mezuzah. The mezuzah is the scribal cloth written on the inside. Some people mistake the ikar and the tafel, the important thing and the subservient item. The main thing is the mezuzah. If one has to triage his resources and has a certain tight budget, he should spend more money on the mezuzah itself and purchase a simpler mezuzah case. Although, of course, in our days, there's no end of people that will make all types of investments in the decorative mezuzah case and either go cheap, or we've even heard stories of people that have mezuzah cases on their doors without anything on the inside, or with a Xeroxed copy or something which is not ritually fit. This is, of course, confusing the two. I don't want to talk about the mezuzah case itself, although, as we described, the hidur mitzvah, it's nice to have a pretty case. It's advisable that if the mezuzah is out of doors, like on the external door of the house, that the mezuzah case be waterproof. They sell waterproof mezuzot because the cloth, the parchment itself, can become damaged through water damage, through weather and things like that. But I want to talk about what you see here, and which I assume for all of us, regardless of our own background, for all of us is the kind of iconic image of a mezuzah, standing there at an angle, pointed towards the, what do you call that? North by northwest, like the Hitchcock movie, at an angle. not at a 45-degree angle exactly, but aimed in. And the nearly universal practice, at least amongst Ashkenazi Judaism, is to attach the mezuzah at a slight angle, angled in to the house, angled in to the room on the right-hand side. On the right-hand side. Why this will be the topic of tonight's discussion, and it is fascinating because it is an example of halachic compromise. Here we go. The Gemara in Masechet Menachot. Most of the discussions of MEZUZAH, as well as of tzitzit that we saw last week in our special guest shiur with Baruch Sterman, are in Masechet Menachot. So here, Menachot, Daf Lamed Gimel Omid Aleph, you see we have these very interesting illustrations here on the page. We'll come to that in a moment. The Gemara in Masechet Menachot, Daf Lamed Gimel Omid Aleph says, Omer Rav Yehuda Omer Rav. Asa'a kamin neger havu avidan. If you attached the mezuzah to the doorpost like a neger is, at least according to Rashi's opinion, a kind of bolt. You see here, this is an illustration from the Minhagei Yisrael of Professor Daniel Sperber, a multi-volume work which I mentioned before. These are illustrations of ancient doorposts, and you can see here, let me make this larger, that the way that the doorpost was constructed, there was, this is called the lintel, the top piece, and the side pieces are the mezuzot, the door posts on which the lintel rests. On the right-hand side going into the house, there was this gap between the stones. You see, on the left-hand side, it's one solid piece. You can see here also. But on the right-hand side, it's two different stones with a little gap here, whether it was a full gap or merely a small gap. And that was constructed because the bolt, the lock on the other side of the door, which was here, could be shifted over to enter into that little empty space in order to lock the door. That's called a neger, at least according to Rashi's opinion. So the Gemara says, Asa'a kemin neger sula. If you attach the mezuzah horizontally, here's Rashi. Asa'a kemin neger. You see, this Rashi, at some point in the history of the printing of the Talmud, in a few cases, there were these little illustrations added. When the illustrations came from is an interesting question. We're going to be talking next week, I hope, about the history of the printing of the Talmud. But these little schematics to demonstrate a point highlight the fact that, if the Gemara had initially come from the 3rd, 4th, 5th centuries with illustrations, it would have been a very different text. Chazal did not draw illustrations to accompany the sugyot, and they articulated everything in words. The problem with words is that they're sometimes hard to see, meaning they're hard to visualize. There are all types of things. Professor Chaim Soloveitchik once famously commented that, there are just certain things that you can't depict in text. Imagine trying to teach someone how to tie their shoes by writing out instructions. It just wouldn't work. So Chazal will depict certain things. Sometimes they'll use metaphors that were relevant in the 3rd, 4th, 5th centuries, which the real meaning is lost to us, and this is one of them. Rashi interprets the word asak kemin neger, shekava v'tachva b'saf, keneger shetochvin hanagarin bekotel kazeh. And then here's this illustration. Right? This little slot in which the bolt could be placed to lock the door. Psula, says Rashi. If you affix the mezuzah horizontally in the shape of the bolt slot, the mezuzah is not valid. Meaning, Rashi says the mezuzah has to be vertical, not horizontal. The mitzvata la tetata ba'orech b'saf kazeh neger kibila. That we don't put here, that it has to stand vertically, not horizontally. Although in this illustration, the vertical placement is misplaced because it's too low down on the door. Generally speaking, on a regular sized door, the mezuzah is in the top third of the doorpost on the right going in. So Rashi says that the reason that, here you go, Rashi says that the reason that the mezuzah is pasul is because it's horizontal and it needs to be attached vertically. But then the Gemara questions, Ini, oh yeah, is that true that the mezuzah has to be vertical and not horizontal? Vaha ki ata Rav Yitzchak Bar Yosef, when Rav Yitzchak Bar Yosef came from Eretz Yisrael to Bavel, he reported, Kulhu mezusta de Rabbi kemin neger havu avidan. That in Rebbe's house, in Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi's house, all of the mezuzot were in the affixed like a neger. They were all this way, but the Gemara said it's pasul. So how could it be pasul? How could it be invalid to attach the mezuzah in the manner of a neger if all of the mezuzot in the great Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi's house were so affixed? So the Gemara answers, Lo kashya, ha da'avida kesichta, ha da'avida keistvira. No, it's not a problem. It's not a problem because there's two different ways of doing it like a neger. And one of them is valid and one of them is invalid. When the Gemara says that if you attach the mezuzah like a neger and it is invalid, that is when it's attached like, that's when it's attached like a sichta. A sichta is like a nail when it's nailed in. But when it's like an it's like an istavira, the way that Rabbi had it, then it's kasher. An istavira is a kind of shape like this. the way that your foot and your leg meet at your ankle. Apparently, their mezuzah, the mezuzah of Rebbe, at least the Gemara says, was attached in a way that the mezuzah case itself was attached horizontally, but it bent up to the vertical. And either the mezuzah case itself, the mezuzah scroll itself, was housed in this part, and only the horizontal part was bolted into the wall, or, according to one interpretation, which is a little hard to understand, but apparently the mezuzah scroll was folded in such a way that it was partially horizontal and partially vertical in this elbow-shaped case and affixed into the wall that way. This seems a little hard for us to imagine because it's so contrary to our contemporary practice, but when you think about the fact that the tefillin parchments themselves, at least the tefillin shel rosh, the tefillin of the head, which we spoke about, I think 3 weeks ago, themselves are folded up almost in this, not exactly origami fashion, but they're folded up in a very precise way to fit into the slots, the 4 slots of the head tefillin. So you can imagine the mezuzah scroll being folded in such a way that it would go this way. This way, says the Gemara, this elbow-shaped affixation, completely foreign to our experience, this was the way that Rebbe's mezuzot were fixed, and those are kasher. And those are kasher, says the Gemara. However, I've just explained the Gemara according to Rashi's opinion. Here's the Rashi. Rashi says, Istavira hainu makom chibur hashok v'haregel, the way that your calf and your foot are affixed at your ankle in that L shape. Umumadhu kazeh kshira. Right? And then Rashi, or at least the illustrations of Rashi, give something that looks like this to demonstrate what it is, and that is kshera. This is permitted. The Tosfot, you remember a few weeks ago we saw the machlokes between Rashi and Tosfot about the placement of the parshiot in the tefillin. So here Rashi and Rabbeinu Tam similarly disagree. Rashi says that the mezuzah has to be vertical, and a horizontal mezuzah is pasul. And Tosfot, without reading this whole lengthy Tosfot on the inside, Tosfot is of the opinion the exact opposite. Tosfot is of the opinion, Rabbeinu Tam is of the opinion, is that it is more proper for the mezuzah to be affixed in its resting form, which is horizontal. How does he know that when you affix the mezuzah that it should be at rest? So he says, obviously, everybody knows that when you go to a synagogue and you open up the Holy Ark, you open up the Aron Kodesh, there are the Sifrei Torah lying down horizontally inside the Ark. Now, wait a second. I see I'm looking at Tehillah Leah on the screen. She just looked up quizzically. You know, when we're not sure of something, we look up like that, as if the answer is somewhere over there. Tosfos, Rabbeinu Tam's description of the arrangement of the Sifrei Torah and the Aron is completely unfamiliar to us, because the universal custom today is that the Sifrei Torah are put into the Ark standing up. Whether the Ashkenazi Sefer Torah, certainly the Sephardi Sefer Torah, which is contained in that canister. And we assume that since that's, the iconic image of what the Torah scrolls in the Ark look like, that must be the case. That must be the way. That must be the law. However, Tosfos reminds us that that is not, in fact, the way it is. As the great Tevye taught us, when we do something so often for so long without remember the reason is, well, it's a tradition. Tradition. It's a tradition, even if we don't remember why we do it that way. And in fact, there is no such halacha that the Torah scroll has to be resting in the ark vertically. I assume that the universal custom evolved that way because, A, it's a little more dramatic to open the Aron and to see them that way, and B, it's just a much more effective use of space to have the scrolls resting vertically, one next to each other. But apparently, in Rabbeinu Tam's time, in Rabbeinu Tam's place, the Torah scrolls rested horizontally. In fact, in most ancient libraries, which held scrolls, not books, before the advent of the Codex book, when everything was in scrolls, the great library of Alexandria, the scrolls, often not in cases or not with our practice of putting them on the Atzei Chaim wooden rollers, the scrolls themselves would just be stored away in cubby holes horizontally. This was the fashion of storing scrolls. There's nothing inherently disrespectful about doing that. So Rabbeinu Tam has the idea that the mezuzah should be akin to the way that the Sefer Torah is stored in the Aron. Rashi, we imagine, might be saying the exact opposite. Rashi himself may have been familiar with the idea that the Torah scroll is stored horizontally in the Aron, but he may be saying in response to Rabbeinu Tam, who will only come a generation later, but in response to the idea represented by Rabbeinu Tam, who's to say that a mezuzah should be affixed in the way that a scroll is at rest in its storage place? Maybe quite the contrary. When the Sefer Torah is taken out, when it's on the move, and this is a halacha, that when the Sefer Torah is out and on the move, we all stand out of respect. Maybe that is conceptually close to how we should view the mezuzah on the door. Is it awake or is it asleep? Pardon the anthropomorphism there. And Rashi rules that the mezuzah should be vertically attached, and Tosfos says it should be horizontally attached. Horizontally attached. There's an interesting shaila. The Trumat Hadeshin who lived in the 15th century. So we're talking already a couple of hundred years after Rashi and Rabbeinu Tam. The Trumat Hadeshin, who was an important Rishon, he lived and worked and wrote about 100 years before the Shulchan Aruch came along and kind of codified everything down. The Trumat Hadeshin, in Ashkenazi Posek, was asked the following question: HaMezuzot nohagin lahaniach b'mezuzot hapetach ba'alachson kedei lekayem perush Rashi uperush Rabbeinu Tam. So already by the time of the Trumat Hadeshin, a compromise had arisen. that the mezuzah would be placed ba'alachson, catty-cornered, right? Neither like Rashi, nor, let me start that again. I'm not drawing very well. Let's clear all this. There's Rashi. There's Rabbeinu Tam. And here's the compromise position. So the question that's asked of the Trumat Hadeshen is, what direction should it be diagonal? That's the word I was searching for. Should it be diagonal facing in, or should it be diagonal facing out? But the idea that we do a compromise in order to accommodate both Rashi's opinion and Rabbeinu Tam's opinion is already extant. The only question is, should it be diagonal tipped into the house, which is, of course, our current practice, or the opposite? And he answers, it seems to me, the matin rosh tzad mezuzah tzad pnim, that the mezuzah should be diagonal, pointing inside, into the house. You know, this is generally the way we orient our mezuzot. The mezuzot are on the right-hand side of the door, facing, tipped diagonally in as you enter the house. So once you're in the house, what about the internal mezuzot? So most rooms, you walk through the house, and the normal way you would walk through the house, passing through each doorway, that determines which is the right-hand side going in. There are certain doorways in a house which are bidirectional. And there's the room that I'm sitting in now, there's only one door in. It's the only way to get into the room. So obviously the mezuzah goes on the right-hand side of the door going into this room. Because if I was passing from the main entrance to my house into this room, I would be going in one direction, and I put the mezuzot on the right-hand side. Certain doors function both as an in and an out, and you have to determine what way is used more often. Is it more often going in, or is it more often going out? And how you would traverse the property if entering from the first room, from the front door, and moving through. And then the Trumat Hadeshen says, and it's apparent, that Rabbeinu Tam, the tzarich la'aniach ha-mezuzah mushkevet, when Rabbeinu Tam says that the mezuzah should be laying down horizontally, or kala rochav mezuzot habayit, tzarich shetehei shiatah ha'elyona letzad hadelet, v'shiatah ha'tachtona letzad reshut harabim, that the top should go inside of the house and the bottom should be pointing towards the outside. V'chein katvu Tosfot in our Gemara in Menachot, the Hedya explicitly, ahahid Yerushalmi demitzarich shetehei shma shel mezuzah ro'eh et avir hapetach v'katvu delafi Rabbeinu Tam delaperish Rabbeinu Tam tzarich la'aniach kedilai. Ulahefech, the question of which side the Shema Yisrael is on. But the interesting thing for our purposes is that already in the 15th century, this compromise had been established, and it wasn't clear, just which way the diagonal should point. The Shulchan Aruch says, Sricha liot skufa, The Shulchan Aruch, the Mechaber, Rabbi Yosef Karo, paskening for Sephardic Jewry, says that the mezuzah should be vertical, like Rashi's opinion. V'yechavein she'eh shma dahainu sof haglila letzad chutz, and the part where Shema is written should be facing out. Hago, what you see here in blue, is the Ramo, the commentary of Rav Moshe Isserles, which establishes the halacha for Ashkenazi Jewry. V'chein nahagu, and that is the practice, to put the mezuzah vertically. Aval yesh omrim shepsula b'skufa. However, we still have to contend with the opinion of Rabbeinu Tam that if you place the mezuzah vertically, it's invalid. Ela tzricha liot shkuva, shochev, horizontal, or chalaroch ha-mezuzah tapetach. But there's a problem. We generally like to cover all of our bases. You know, we talked about the kos shel bracha a few weeks ago. So there's one opinion that the kos shel bracha is about 3 ounces. And there's another opinion that the kos shel bracha needs to be 5 ounces. And even though the halacha is like the more moderate position, the halacha is not like the Chazon Ish in this matter. Nevertheless, if you have a kos that holds 5 or 6 ounces, as most cups anyway do, it's better to use a Kiddush cup that fulfills the mainstream opinion and also fulfills the stringent position, because 5 ounces also contains 3 ounces. And if you can cover all of your bases, or in the words of the halachic nomenclature, yotzei yedei kol hashitot, or yotzei yedei kulam, to fulfill all of the positions, so that's preferable, because by doing the more stringent position, which is not so excessive after all, and is not so, you know, we're a society that downs 12 ounces cans of Coke like it's nothing. So to add an extra 2 ounces or less, of course, there's some outstanding financial challenge to nearly double your wine intake over Shabbat, or some other reason to avoid it. Why not fulfill all the opinions? This is not a machloket about which we can say fulfill all the positions, because it is either vertical or it is horizontal. But it can't be both. It's either this or it's that. So the Ramos says the halacha is essentially like Rashi, v'chein nahagu. The custom is to follow the position of placing it vertically, but there's this problem, because we would also like to account for Rabbeinu Tam's position that it be horizontal. So he adds medaktikin, people who are careful about mitzvot. You know, the kinds of people that would normally take 5-ounce cups in order to be careful to fulfill all the opinions. Yotzin yedei shneihem, they fulfill both opinions by menichim oto b'shafua ba'alachson, by tilting it in at a slight angle. V'chein ro'oi linhog, and that is the proper custom to follow, the nearly universally recognized image of what a mezuzah is, slightly tilted in to the northwest, not at a 45-degree angle, at a slightly less sharp angle, but pointed inwards, in order to kind of pay honor to the position of Rabbeinu Tam, that it should be horizontal, but essentially following Rashi's opinion that it be vertical, which seems to be the more proper opinion. V'chein noagin b'medinot elu. And this is the practice in Ashkenazic lands. V'yechavein shehei rosh ha-mezuzah dahainu shema l'tzad pnim v'shiyata achara. Now you see this little footnote Yud Dalet. This is the position of the Beur HaGra, the Vilna Gaon, who wrote a commentary on the Shulchan Aruch. When the Ramah said that the Medaktikim, the people who are punctilious in their observance, do the compromise, do the diagonal, the Gra, the Vilna Gaon, says the Yotzin Yedei Shteihem, Kemo Katuv Shebemezuzah Debei Rebbe, Kemo Shekatuv Tosfot Sham, Hilchach Nira V'chulei Aval Le'inyan Dina Kaimalan Kerashi. But the Gra says no. The halacha is like Rashi. The halacha is like Rashi to put the mezuzah vertically. To put the mezuzah vertically. V'chein osin b'sefer Torah. And similarly, he says the Sefer Torah should be housed vertically. In Eretz Yisrael, the mainstream Ashkenazic practice developed like the Vilna Gaon. The Vilna Gaon, who was the great opponent in the 18th century of Hasidut, of the Hasidic movement. The Vilna Gaon had a group of students who came on Aliyah. They were called the Talmidei Hagra. And they established what's often called the Yishuv Hayashan, the old settlement of Jews in Yerushalayim. There were always Jews in Eretz Yisrael. From the day that Yehoshua ben Nun crossed the Jordan and entered Eretz Yisrael, there have always been Jews in the land of Israel. Although for a very long time, there were very few Jews in Eretz Yisrael. But there's been an uninterrupted presence of the Jewish people in the land of Israel from the day 40 years after the Exodus that Joshua led the children of Israel across the Jordan River. But in the early 19th century, when the religious community from Europe started coming in the early days of the return of Jews to Eretz Yisrael, before Herzl, before political Zionism, so those students of the Vilna Gaon established very many practices in Yerushalayim, in what is sometimes called the Minhag Yerushalayim, the Jerusalem custom, for a whole variety of things. And these were influenced by practices of the Vilna Gaon, even though many of those practices did not become mainstream amongst Ashkenazic Jewry back in Europe. They became the mainstream practice in Jerusalem and in Eretz Yisrael. So those of you that have visited Yerushalayim know that in Ma'ariv, during the weekday evening service, after Shema, there are 3 blessings, including the third longer blessing, Baruch Atah Hashem Omein Le'olam, Baruch Atah Hashem Le'olam Omein V'Amein. This blessing is omitted here in Eretz Yisrael because it was not the practice of the Vilna Gaon to recite that. The Vilna Gaon was was not in favor of reciting too many piyutim, liturgical poetry, which is often recited in the davening, particularly on Yomim Tovim, on holidays in Chutz La'aretz. Those are largely skipped here in Eretz Yisrael. The Vilna Gaon was a great advocate of lighting the Hanukkah menorah out of doors, and anybody that spends time in Yerushalayim during Hanukkah knows that people have these glass boxes that are sometimes affixed to the entrances to the homes, and because you can't light the candles just outside, the wind will blow them out, so you put them in these glass boxes. Sometimes houses have these glass cases like affixed into the outer part of the house. If you've ever walked through the old city on Hanukkah, this is practice. And the minhag hagra is to follow the strict position of Rashi that the mezuzah is not diagonal, is not trying to cover both bases, but is in fact vertical. And even amongst Ashkenazim in Eretz Yisrael, very often the practice is against the almost iconic universal way of mezuzah. If you go to give any school kid a crayon and a piece of paper and ask them to draw a mezuzah, they'll draw it like this, diagonally placed, because this is the image of what a mezuzah looks like. If you're shooting a Hollywood movie and you're showing a Jewish home, they're going to put the mezuzah on the door in this position because that's what everyone is used to. But in Eretz Yisrael, in Yerushalayim in particular, many people follow the position of the Vilna Gaon and affix their mezuzot vertically. In fact, my own mezuzot in my own home, I follow this practice because if you think about it, I don't know, I have no evidence one way or another, but if you think about it from the Vilna Gaon's position, when we can, we try to cover all of our bases, if possible. You can cover all your bases with the Rashi and Rabbeinu Tam tefillin. First put on the Rashi tefillin, then put on the Rabbeinu Tam tefillin. You can cover all your bases with the machlokas between Rav Moshe Feinstein and the Chazon Ish about how big your Kiddush cup has to be. Take a larger Kiddush cup. Rav Moshe doesn't say that your Kiddush cup can only be 3 ounces. He says it has to be at least 3 or 3.3 ounces. And if you have a 5-ounce Kiddush cup, that certainly covers the minimum amount. With a mezuzah, you can't do that. There is no such practice of putting 2 mezuzot on one door. It has to either be like this or be like that. And the compromise, although spiritually, conceptually, theoretically is a nice idea, in some cases you can't compromise. Sometimes diagonal is neither horizontal nor vertical. And since the mainstream halacha is to follow Rashi's opinion against Rabbeinu Tam, vertical, so the Vilna Gaon says, put it like Rashi. I'm sorry, Rabbeinu Tam, we can't accommodate your opinion as much as we would like to do. Sometimes in halachic decision making, you have to come down on one side against the other. Nevertheless, it seems to me that the very widespread practice throughout the world amongst Ashkenazim is to affix the mezuzah the way you see it in the picture, with the slight diagonal facing in. It does seem, and this is the point that Professor Sperber was making with these diagrams, that Rashi's interpretation of what the neger is correct. You see from the archaeological evidence that the neger was a horizontal slot that you could slide the bolt through to lock the door. And that seems like pretty strong evidence for Rashi's opinion that the horizontal affixation is pasul. This is the shape that the Gemara specifies is pasul, is invalid. And from the archaeological evidence, it seems that Rashi's position is bolstered, if not bolted, is bolstered, and that's even more reason to understand why the mainstream halacha followed his opinion against that of Rabbeinu Tam. Even though many people follow this compromised diagonal opinion, and many people, including all Sfaradim and Ashkenazim that follow the Vilna Gaon's opinion, follow the strict vertical opinion, nobody today follows Tosfot's opinion of placing it horizontally, and somebody that did affix their mezuzah horizontally, it would be hard to say that they have properly fulfilled the mitzvah. So go vertical or go diagonal according to your custom, your family custom, or the local custom where you happen to live. And it's an interesting test case of the development of the halachic practice of the way to affix the mezuzah over the centuries, and with an interesting insight from Professor Sperber about the way doors were once constructed in the ancient world. Next week, we'll talk about the history of the printing of the Gemara, of the Talmud. I'll be sending out a link to an online exhibit that has very many images and things to read and things to look at. If you have a chance before next week to take a look at that, it's a good idea. Yes, so Judith points out that in the gates of the old city, you have these very large, ornate mezuzot. I'm sorry, I wish I would have thought to show a picture of them, and they're almost embedded into the wall. And this is something you do see around Yerushalayim, that houses that have a courtyard or other things, sometimes they will put a little nook into the stone of the gate into the courtyard, or the stone of the doorway, so that there's a kind of indentation to house the mezuzah. When after 1967, when the old city was recaptured, people went back to the old city, and there were homes which were once Jewish homes, which had been, of course, under Arab occupation between 1940 and 1967. These were Arab-owned homes, but you could see that on the front door there was the indentation which once housed the mezuzah. A very fine indication that this was once a Jewishly owned home, which is another type of archaeological, pardon the expression, archaeological piece of evidence connecting the halacha and the Jewish people and the Jewish land. So we will meet again next week, and Shabbat Shalom.